Chamber of Deputies. I would also like to remind you that our colleagues are able to participate remotely as allowed by the Committee on the Rules of Procedure. The hearing on today's agenda is part of the fact-finding investigation into the geopolitical dynamics in the Arctic region. We shall hear Professor Gunnar Rekvig, Manager of Global Arctic. On behalf of the members of this committee, I would like to welcome and thank Professor Rekvig for taking part in our session remotely. I would also like to remind you that Global Arctic Project started in 2014 upon an initiative of the Northern Research Forum and the Thematic Network on Geopolitics and Security of the University of the Arctic, with the aim of defining an interdisciplinary approach to the Arctic region, keeping all aspects into account: ecological, cultural, economic, geopolitical and social. Considering the limited time we have available, I'll hand it over to you, Professor Rekvig.
Saying to the honorable members of the Chamber of Deputies, thank you very kindly for the opportunity to address you on the matter of Arctic governance. I will in this talk also highlight historical Nordic-Russian cooperation mechanisms, as well as the evolving security considerations in the High North. My perspective draws on my research on Arctic international relations, with a particular focus on the Nordic peace, Cold War trust building, and the geopolitical dynamics within Arctic governance frameworks. Today's Arctic is a region in transition. Think of the Arctic as a microcosm reflecting broader shifts in the international order. The Arctic region stretches over 40 million square kilometers, a population of about 4 million people. I speak to you today from the region, the most populated area in the Arctic, comprising northern parts of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and northwest Russia. This region today lies at the nexus of rather complex geopolitical dynamics alongside climate change. The developments that are happening here amplify global challenges related to resource extraction, maritime trade routes, and strategic competition between great powers. Looking a bit at the historical evolution of Arctic governance frameworks, the post-Cold War period witnessed the establishment of formal Arctic governance structures that were built upon previous, primarily bilateral arrangements. The 1993 Kirkenes Declaration launched the Barents Euro-Arctic cooperation, institutionalizing relations across northern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and northwest Russia, the Barents region. This multilateral framework encompassed 13 administrative regions in these countries. In 1996, the Arctic Council emerged as the primary circumpolar governance forum, uniting the 8 Arctic states with permanent participants representing indigenous peoples. Its mandate focused on sustainable development and environmental protection, while explicitly excluding military security. This limitation is constraining the effectiveness of the Arctic Council in addressing the emerging security challenges that are happening today as we speak. Still, the contemporary Arctic governance landscape encompasses several frameworks that are existing and ongoing. Maybe the most important is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, that is providing the legal framework for maritime boundary delimitation and continental shelf claims. We have the International Maritime Organization that helped establish the Polar Code for shipping regulations in Arctic waters. We have the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, the objective of which is to prevent unregulated fishing in the high seas portion of the Central Arctic Ocean. Alongside these, we have bilateral agreements addressing specific issues between Arctic states, including fisheries management and boundary delimitations. This multi-layered architecture historically functioned effectively during periods of low geopolitical tension. However, it now faces profound challenges as the international system transitions towards multipolarity. And this is especially visible in the Arctic. And because of that, we can also, inside these governance frameworks, include NATO's expanded Arctic presence. NATO functioning both as a military alliance and a de facto governance actor through its Nordic memberships. I also want to present the Nordic-Russian cooperation mechanism, especially looking at the Norwegian case. I am Norwegian myself, so it's close to home. The Norwegian case of Norway-Russia relations, especially going back to the Cold War and the Soviet Union, demonstrate how trust or confidence-building measures can facilitate cooperation between ideological adversaries, ideological enemies in a sense. The foundation of this relationship traces back to the Soviet liberation of northern Norway in 1944 and their subsequent unilateral withdrawal from Norway in 1945, making Norway the only country from which the Soviet forces voluntarily withdrew after having entered in World War II. Immediately after the Second World War, in the Cold War, Norway implemented several trust-building initiatives toward the Soviet Union while maintaining its NATO membership. First, we have a culture agreement in 1956. Norway became the first Western country to establish a formal cultural agreement with the Soviet Union, facilitating exchanges in sports, film, theater, and music. It was characterized as an opening in the Iron Curtain. The culture agreement leads to scientific collaboration from 1958 between Norwegian and Soviet Marine Research Institute, established joint monitoring protocols for the Barents Sea ecosystem and fisheries. This leads to the Joint Fisheries Commission from 1974, a bilateral mechanism dividing fishing quotas in a 50-50 split. This Fisheries Commission is still operating in spite of the war in Ukraine. Then we have Barents sea boundary negotiations over a disputed sea boundary. The negotiations lasted from 1970s until 2010. And during the negotiation period, the disputed area, we had a moratorium on hydrocarbon extraction. The 2010 treaty that was signed between Norway and the Russian Federation represented a balanced resolution, dividing the area equitably. The last reassurance policy or trust-building policy Norway enacted were unilateral military restrictions. Norway implemented several self-imposed military limitations. We prohibited foreign military bases on Norwegian soil in peacetime. We forbade nuclear weapons on Norwegian territory. We restricted NATO military activity close to the Soviet border. These mechanisms demonstrate how peripheral regions like Norway, and especially North Norway, can navigate complex geopolitical relationships through strategically calibrated engagements. Norway's approach recognized the fundamental asymmetry in its relationship with the Soviet Union, while preserving its core security alignment with NATO, producing regional stability during the height of Cold War confrontation. The northern flank of NATO was peaceful in the Cold War. Then moving on to contemporary transformations in Arctic security. So the post-Cold War Arctic governance system is currently undergoing rather profound transformations driven by two interconnected factors: the war in Ukraine and accelerating climate change. The war in Ukraine has marked a decisive disruption to previously held assumptions of Arctic exceptionalism, accelerating securitization while suspending long-standing cooperative frameworks. The work of the Arctic Council effectively paused when Russia assumed chairmanship in 2021. 7 other Arctic states boycotting meetings in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Simultaneously, climate change proceeds at an unprecedented rate, with the Arctic warming 4 times faster than the global average. Rapid ice decline has led to climatologists to project ice-free summers potentially by 2030. That's 5 years away. In 2023, the Northwest Passage recorded historically low ice coverage, while the northern sea route over Russia was largely ice-free in August. These twin drivers create conditions that connect the Atlantic Arctic with the Pacific Arctic, challenging the previous segmentation of Arctic security complexes. 3 key developments illustrate this transformation. First, Russia's Arctic military posture has expanded beyond Atlantic-oriented operations. Recent years have witnessed significant enhancement of military infrastructure along the entire Arctic coastline of Russia. The Northern Fleet is transitioning from a primarily Atlantic-focused force to a trans-Arctic capability with power projection potential towards the North Pacific over the entire Arctic arc. Second, China's growing Arctic presence represents a multidimensional challenge transcending the Atlantic-Pacific divide. Beijing's Polar Silk Road initiative, research stations in Iceland and Svalbard, Norway, and investments in Russian LNG projects reveal a comprehensive approach, merging economic, scientific, and strategic objectives. Third, as the ice coverage diminishes, new maritime corridors connecting the Pacific and Atlantic basins alter shipping patterns, creating region-wide security vulnerabilities and challenge established security frameworks. Critical choke points, including the Bering Strait, Davis Strait, Denmark Strait, and Fram Strait, acquire heightened strategic significance. These developments have prompted reconsideration of existing security arrangements. The Nordic countries have undergone a fundamental realignment, with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, effectively turning the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake, and extending the alliance's direct border with Russia from approximately 200 kilometers to over 1,300 kilometers. So the current state we are experiencing is deterrence without reassurance. The historical Nordic-Soviet trust-building efforts stand in rather stark contrast to contemporary Nordic-Russian relations. The balance between deterrence and reassurance that characterized the Cold War approach has shifted today toward deterrence without the corresponding reassurance mechanisms. The transition is evident in Norway's departure from, for example, the self-imposed military restrictions. We are hosting permanent US Marines in peacetime. We have joint military exercises close to the Russian border. We're hosting US attack submarines in my hometown of Tromsø, North Norway. We also witness increased NATO naval presence in the Barents Sea as a new normal. Similar patterns are evident across the entire Nordic region, with Finland and Sweden's NATO accession representing the most significant regional security realignment since the end of the Cold War. The Nordic region has lost the neutral, non-aligned buffer states that were Finland and Sweden. In this current state, we also have China's emerging role in Arctic governance. China's Arctic presence has evolved from primarily scientific engagement to a comprehensive multi-dimensional strategy. Beyond its self-designation as a near-Arctic state, China has developed substantial scientific infrastructure, including research stations in Svalbard and Iceland. Recent concerns have emerged regarding potential dual-use activities, where civilian scientific research may serve military purposes. Reports in 2024 indicated that China Research Institute of Radio Wave Propagation, active in Svalbard, Norway, had connections to the People's Liberation Army electronic firms. This has prompted increased Norwegian scrutiny regarding Chinese activities at the Yellow River Station in Ny-Ålesund. China has developed distinctive Arctic narratives that align with Russian perspectives while advancing its own strategic objectives. The Ukraine conflict has intensified China-Russian cooperation, as sanctions have increased Russian dependence on Chinese markets and investments, particularly in energy infrastructure along the Northern Sea route. I'll end by mentioning some future aspects of Arctic governance. So as the Arctic transitions toward a multipolar reality, some of the challenges that emerge are institutional fragmentation. The suspension of Russia's Arctic participation in key cooperative frameworks has created governance gaps, particularly in environmental monitoring and emergency response capacity. Militarization without dialogue. So unlike the Cold War, the current military buildup in the Arctic occurs without corresponding confidence-building measures, increasing the risk of miscalculation, unintended consequences. Climate security nexus. Accelerating environmental changes create new security vulnerabilities, including infrastructure instability due to permafrost thaw, maritime traffic, and monitored waters. For middle powers like Italy with Arctic interests, there are several considerations that merit attention. Maritime domain awareness. So integrated approaches to monitoring surface and subsurface activities become increasingly vital as maritime traffic expands across previously ice-covered waters. Environmental monitoring. Collaborative environmental assessment supports proactive planning for rapid changes in ice coverage and ecological impacts, potentially creating space for depoliticized cooperation. Expanded stakeholder engagement. An Arctic security stakeholder roundtable, including non-Arctic naval powers like Italy, Poland, and even Japan and South Korea, could address trans-Arctic security challenges linking security complexes. And critical infrastructure protection. As economic activity increases in the Arctic, so does vulnerability of critical infrastructure to gray zone threats, requiring cooperative protective measurements. To conclude the transformation of Arctic governance reflects the broader systemic transitions from bipolarity to unipolarity in the post-Cold War period, and now we're moving to multipolarity. Whereas Cold War interaction patterns balance deterrence with reassurance, today we're moving to deterrence without reassurance. And I think, yeah, for timekeeping, I stop there. So thank you very much for your attention.
Grazie.
Thank you very much. Before handing it over to our colleagues for their questions, I would like to ask you a question myself. You were mentioning a Chinese research station in New Allison, the Yellow River Station Research Center. Should we be worried about Chinese activity in the Arctic region? How much should we actually be worried about it? And how worried are other Arctic countries, for example, Norway? Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, you have the floor.
Grazie. Your question. Norway is taking steps now to mitigate the risk posed by the Chinese research on Svalbard and within this region. Norway has very strict rules on how this research collaboration that is happening on Svalbard can be conducted. And we are now reminding the Chinese as to follow protocol on these islands. Norway is also restricting previous freedoms that were granted all people living on the Svalbard Islands. So in a sense, we are nationalizing to the extent that we can. There was one example a couple of years ago where the Chinese were marking an anniversary at the, let's see, I got some echo now. Yeah, they marked the anniversary and they had somebody show up in military uniform. That is strictly prohibited. So Norway brought this up with the Chinese embassy in Oslo, and we have been reassured that this will not happen again. So we are taking steps to mitigate what they are doing. I hope that kind of answered your question.
Grazie mille.
Thank you very much. Then MP Orsini would like to ask a question as well. He's an MP from the party Forza Italia and is a long-standing member of this committee and part of the Italian delegation to the NATO PA. First of all, I would like to thank our guest for his really interesting contribution. I would like to ask two separate questions, and one relates to the end of your contribution, Professor Rekvig. You explained very well how the governance in the Arctic region has been codified, so to say, for a long time as part of the Cold War framework. But today we live in a multipolar world, and old patterns do not work anymore. So, according to you, what happens now? Is there a chance to redefine an Arctic framework that can ensure overall security? And of course we are especially interested in European and Western security. And if so, how can we achieve this goal? Then I'll move on to the second question, which is not totally different from the previous one, and it's about Greenland, which was on all front pages of newspapers after Trump's statements. Of course, the sovereignty of the reign of Denmark cannot be doubted, cannot be challenged, and so all choices must be taken by Denmark in accordance with the inhabitants of Greenland, of course. But there is another interesting theme here. Trump's posture is, of course, original, as we can say, and it raises a question about the future of a crucial area in the Arctic region, which is very important because of natural resources there, and which is fragile. It's hard to imagine that Greenland might be managed within a global dynamic, considering the 30,000-40,000 inhabitants that live on the island. Maybe the EU might play a role, even though Greenland is not part of the EU, although it belongs to the Kingdom of Denmark. So how much should we worry about the future of Greenland? That is my question. Thank you, MP Orsini. Are you finished with your question? Yes, okay. Then MP Della Vedova. He was Under Secretary of State for Foreign Relations, and he has dealt with the Arctic a lot. When I visited Svalbard Islands 7 to 8 years ago, I visited the CNR mission there. And at the time, we lived in a different world. I would also like to thank the professor for his contribution. At that time, we could still speak of the Arctic exceptionalism, as he was saying earlier on. So we had a sort of efficient multilateralism, but times have changed. Also, because of climate change, and climate change, it's especially quick and fast in this area of the world, with repercussions on the whole planet, but with especially strong repercussions on this area in terms of the exploitation of resources, in terms of maritime routes, and in strategic terms. As the professor said earlier on, we are moving from multilateralism to cooperation or even to confrontation between superpowers. We've seen what the US is doing with Greenland and with Canada. Yesterday, President Trump said that he will get Greenland one way or another. We've talked about Russia, about China. So what I would like to ask you, linking back to what my colleague Orsini was saying, the US has a certain posture, nationalistic, imperialistic posture, and Denmark, Norway, and other European countries might be inefficient in responding. So do you think that the EU as such might be able to closely cooperate with Canada and might be able to be a partner for dialogue with superpowers? Or do you think that European countries will still act as separate units? Maybe we should have a superpower thinking as well to face the situation. Thank you. Then we have a question from MP Marocco, Forza Italia. Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman? Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I would also like to thank all of you for this interesting meeting. And then I would like to ask three very direct questions. First of all, what is the role of the Arctic Council today, according to you, especially after the situation with Russia? And then what is the boundary between environmental security and military security in the Arctic, whether the two dimensions can be actually separated? And according to you, what are the main political challenges for the Arctic region in the next 10 to 15 years? Thank you once again. Thank you. Professor, you have the floor.
Right. I will try to, let me see here. It's getting echo again. I'm going to turn this to the original audio. Maybe that works. Okay. To answer the first question from the honorable member, what the West can do kind of to meet the security challenges. A lot of this is actually happening now. One of the things that I think is important to understand is how the Nordic region has shifted. Putin accomplished something that the Nordic countries were not able to do by themselves. He has united us in a security alliance. He has united us inside NATO. The last time the Nordic countries were united in an alliance was a Kalmar Union of the 1300s. Since then, we have had a lot of conflict. The Nordic countries up until 1812 were basically in a de facto state of war. After 1812, this is when you have a shift to, in a sense, this idea of a Nordic peace. But still, in a Nordic peace constellation, we were never able to unify in a security framework. Sweden and Finland, they were staunch neutral powers. After World War II, Sweden tried to kind of have a neutral Scandinavian defense union. Again, it fails. But now we are. So the Nordic countries are being coordinated in NATO out of Norfolk, Virginia, basically. All the Nordic countries will establish some NATO offices, NATO headquarters in Norfolk. So within the alliance, we are now creating a bloc. And we're also investing quite heavily in rebuilding the military capacity that we have in the north. For example, we have some challenges related to logistics and infrastructure. Finnmark County, that is a county in North Norway that is bordering Russia. It is the biggest county in Norway. It is larger than the Kingdom of Denmark. It is larger than Belgium. But it's only one road connecting it to the rest of Norway. That road is also very prone to avalanches in wintertime, effectively cutting off that entire county. So these issues of infrastructure challenges is being addressed right now. We're also thinking in terms of the non-Arctic middle powers stakeholder engagement within the Arctic region. So there is already the Arctic Roundtable, the Arctic Security Roundtable that exists, but we think that there should be more non-Arctic member states to enter this Arctic Roundtable. It could also be established a separate non-Arctic security stakeholder roundtable on bringing these middle powers into the Arctic, like Italy, like Germany, Spain, Poland, the United Kingdom, so that they can maybe bring some semblance of stability to this region, to meet this Sino-Russian, the China-Russia bloc that is coming. Alongside this Sino-Russian formation, we can also expect much greater BRICS engagement in the Arctic. As Russia will not engage with the West, they are going to increase exposure to the other BRICS nations within this Arctic constellation. And that is also going to provide a challenge for us. Moving on to this Greenland. Greenland, Donald Trump argues that they need Greenland for international security. He has said something like you have Russian boats all over the place, you have Chinese boats all over the place, warships. So the United States government under Trump is arguing that Greenland's annexation is necessary for international security. But from a security perspective, I mean, that doesn't make a lot of sense because we're all friends here. We're in the same alliance. As Nordics, the Danes included, we are really integrated into that American sphere of NATO. The Americans already have the Space Force base at Pitufik on Greenland, and they cooperate very closely with Denmark and NATO for monitoring Russian sea and air activity on Greenland. So maybe it's more of an interest in the mineral wealth that Greenland has, the rare earth deposits. So it's maybe a return to this 19th century type expansionism thinking to lock the Arctic from Chinese influence. But also the Americans, they lack a historical understanding of the legacy of colonialism in Greenland, that the Greenlandics have suffered under Danish rule. There are a lot of wrongs that still hasn't been righted. And the United States is not presenting itself as a better colonizer for the Greenlandic people. So the poor relations between the United States and Denmark, Greenland, and perhaps even Canada, yeah, it could make a backlash in Arctic cooperation. So there is this balancing act that needs to be done here. Moving on to the next question, I think I've addressed some of these things, but in meeting future challenges within the security framework of the Arctic, again, we have to understand that the small states of the Arctic, the functions of these countries have shifted quite dramatically in the post-Cold War. So in the Cold War, the small Arctic states they balanced the superpowers. So the Norway, Denmark, and Iceland, being NATO founding members, even inside NATO, they still had these ideas of neutrality and non-alignment. They had ideas of building bridges between East and West. These functions that led to the, in a sense, trust building or confidence building with the Soviet Union that created a very low tension, peaceful Northern Europe. These functions are gone today. The war in Ukraine created a knee-jerk reaction, if you will, in the Nordic region. It was completely unthinkable that this could happen. So we then saw this need to re-securitize the North. This is also why there was such an enormous shift in Sweden and Finland when it came to support for joining NATO. So the small Arctic states have changed into becoming securitized within the Arctic. We're also seeing then the influx. We're welcoming in the middle powers like Italy. We would hope that Italy can take a larger role within this changing security framework that is happening. And we hope that we can also link to other like-minded actors like Japan and South Korea and even Singapore. So there was an attempt not that long ago to establish NATO embassies in Japan and South Korea and New Zealand and Australia that France blocked. But we're now also seeing that Japan is wanting to engage within the Nordic Arctic region to support us in countering this China-Russian block that is coming up. Right. So over the next 10 to 15 years, I think a lot of what is going to happen depends on what the outcome of the war in Ukraine is going to be. Now there are talks started with the Trump administration between Ukraine and Russia. So I think the outcome of those talks are really going to be critical for understanding how the security situation is going to change. But nonetheless, the European bloc within NATO is going to take on a much larger responsibility for European security and also North European security on the northern flank of NATO. Yeah, I don't know if that answered all your questions.
Thank you very much. I cannot see any more questions from our colleagues, and I would really like to thank Professor Rekvig for his insightful contribution. We will keep in touch and we'll let you know how our investigation carries on.